All right, welcome everybody, and I'll give us a couple of minutes for a couple of announcements as we start off our fall member lecture series. I want to thank everybody for being here tonight. This is our kickoff lecture. We have in this fall, we have one, two, three, four, five, six, eight lectures this fall. So I hope you take advantage of that. As always, that is free for members of the Friends of the Cabildo. We'll probably have about 10 more in the 8 to 10 more in the spring, and then we'll have a couple in the summer as well. So you get about 15 to 20 lectures every year that are free with your membership. And also, if you're not aware, this month is Museum Month. So if you are a Friends of the Cabildo member, you can go to 29 different museums in the city of New Orleans, include the World War II Museum, um, uh, Old Ursuline Convent, BK House, Herman Grima House, Ogden Museum. A lot of great museums that are worth going and taking advantage of during this month. You get to take a guest with you as well at any level. So you can go with a guest. If you wanted to go uh 26 times to the World War II Museum, you and a guest can go 26 times and go to the World War II Museum. So I hope you take advantage of that. Um, a couple other upcoming events that the Friends have. We have unfortunately we've had our Sicilian history tour. I'm sorry to say we basically have sold out of every single tour all the way to 2026 into January. So if you're looking for that, keep your eyes and ears to our emails because we do announce them and they go very quickly. So please do take advantage of that. At the museum, they're going to be redoing the Katrina exhibit, and that's going to be opening the weekend of August 29th and 30th. We're going to have an event on the 30th. Um, on some Banksy information with a Banksy book that's coming out. So look for more information on that. It's going to be an RSVP event, so I hope you take advantage of that. And it'll be obviously free for members. And then also we have our class with Dr. Charles Chamberlain called the Founding of New Orleans class. You might have seen that he has a new book coming out about a comprehensive history of Louisiana and New Orleans. And that class is in late September, so I hope you take advantage of that. As always, we have our concert, film series, all that kind of good stuff. But tonight we're going to be talking about Native American history, and specifically about Native American history that's here in Louisiana. And our speaker tonight is Jackson Cantrell, and where he's going to be doing this, where he has a PowerPoint that where he is actually going to be speaking through there. So he's going to click it and get it to go. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. I'm welcome. I'm happy to ask them of Jackson at the end, but you do put him in there even if it's in the first 5 minutes. So let's learn about some Native American history in Mandeville. Welcome, Jackson. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate you very much speaking to us tonight.
I'm very happy to be here, and if everybody's ready, I think we're ready to get started.
Yeah.
All right. And if you want to know anything about me, hold your questions till the end, because since this is a pre-recorded presentation, I'm not going to be able to respond since I'm not going to be the one talking. It's previous me. All right. Without further ado, hello everyone. I'm Jackson Cantrell. I'm very happy to kick off this Friends of the Cabildo lecture series.
Jackson, I think that might have been me that did that. All right, we want to start over again. Sorry about that. I thought that I could hit that and move that out of the way. Yeah, there we go. There we go. Sorry about that. I thought I could move your video out of the way. So if you want to do share screen again, set it up, do it
Okay,
again.
I got
Sorry
you.
about that.
No worries. Zoom always has its benefits and its quirks. So,
Yeah.
All right. Again, without further ado, here we go.
There we go. And muted you. Jackson, you are muted right now.
Perkins and Miss.
There we go. Let's try that one more time.
Give me 1 second. So is the audio playing through the recording?
It just was a second ago. So it went muting on your screen. I don't know why I did that. So just try it one more time and we'll go there. We got someone that
Okay. All right. Third time's a charm. There we
Hello,
go.
everyone. I'm Jackson Cantrell.
No, you got to share the screen.
Pick up this friends of the.
All righty. Give me 1 second, y'all. All right. Fourth time's a charm. Here we go.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jackson Cantrell. I'm very happy to kick off this Friends of the Cabildo lecture series, and I'm especially glad to introduce you all to the Acolapissa people. Their one-time home in what is now present-day Mandeville, Louisiana, was just 5 miles from the house where I grew up. Our lecture this evening is meant to honor the Acolapissa and their descendants who are alive and well today. And I'd also like to make special mention of Mr. Greyhawk Perkins and Miss Robin Perkins, who've been instrumental throughout the entirety of my research into this topic. And they're the ones that first sparked this bit of curiosity. But before we start, a bit of housekeeping, if you will. I'm going to take advantage of our chat tonight being recorded because the upcoming slides are absolutely loaded with information, lots of details, and many old maps. I have this recorded so that you can go back and parse through at your own pace. And if you want anything to be reiterated, it's at your discretion, at your leisure. But let's get started. I'd like to begin by acknowledging all peoples who are the original inhabitants of the lands known today as Louisiana. We honor these peoples, their past, their present, their descendants, and their future. Certain tribes and bands listed here, many of you might recognize, but a great number are referred to as Louisiana's little nations, or les petites nations, as the French would say. The Acolapissa were one such group. And in the slides to follow, I'll be sharing drawings and photos of various peoples. Only 2 will actually be of the Acolapissa. The others are not meant to stand in or be substitutes, but I have them there for frame of reference and frame of mind. I include these images to help us better imagine their lives. Here's how we'll spend the evening. In discussing various people from the past, it's very important to get the context of what all was going on in the wider world around them and where they were at the time. Our review of maps and history will do exactly that. Then I'll introduce you to a teenager from France by the name of André Pénicaud. He interacted with the Acolapissa for 14 years off and on, even living with them for a while. So his journals served as primary source material for historians. From there, we'll go on to discuss the massacre that took place on the land that would later become the city of Mandeville and how that impacted the Acolapissa and others. The Acolapissa were an indigenous people who lived all across today's St. Tammany Parish, Washington, and Tangipahoa. For those not familiar with Louisiana geography, these ancestral lands are on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain, about 35 miles from New Orleans. Although I speak their tribal name in the past tense, their descendants live on today. The historical era that we will examine this evening is a subset of what is referred to by historians as the contact period, roughly 1500 to 1750. This was the critical time frame when contact was made between indigenous nations and European powers. And as we all know, this drastically impacted their respective ways of life. Between 1702 and 1714, the Acolapissa were living on the banks of Castine Bayou, or their ancestral homes. If you've ever been to North Lake Nature Center, Pelican Park, or Fontainebleau State Park in Mandeville, you too have walked those same grounds. And as those of you are who are in the real estate business know the most important attribute of one's home is location, location, location. So let's zoom in on some maps. Here's a close-up of that 1720 map. But let me go right ahead and make some annotations. I've highlighted not just the lands occupied by the Acolapissa, but also 4 other peoples or nations. These 5 groups had key interactions with one another, some of which were not positive at all. And as we start to look at newer maps than this 1720s version, you'll start to see details generally become more accurate. The mouth of the Mississippi will gradually not look, well, not so much like a squid. But one thing to note is that maps from the 1500s through the 1800s were probably out of date by the time each were published. Cartographers could just not keep up with exploration. When we bump ahead to 1776, when this map was published, the map makers had a much clearer definition of Louisiana's rivers. The area in yellow was long noted as the ancient lands of the Acolapissa, and it was bound on the west by the Tangipahoa River and on the east by the Pearl. One thing to note is that the Tangipahoa River, and later on the parish, were named after the native people called the Tangipahoa. They were a subtribe of the Acolapissa. If you please notice the small yellow area just south of Lake Maurepas. It was noted in 1682 as where their villages were found. You can see here that by 1848, the 2 rivers, Tangipahoa and the Pearl, were the boundaries of certain parishes. These boundary lines and the actual names of the parishes have changed quite a bit over time. But as of today, many of you locals know that out of the 64 parishes that make up Louisiana, 9 are named for various so-called saints. These saints were often just usually benefactors or local heroes, and sometimes not even local heroes. And today's St. Tammany Parish is where my hometown of Mandeville is located. And Mandeville is the site of a very large Acolapissa village in the early 1700s. Roughly 3,000 people lived there. And the parish itself was named for Tamanend, a famous Native American chief from the Delaware area. His assistance with early settlers was crucial in saving their lives, and in the 1700s, there were popular social clubs nicknamed for him. Tammany societies met to discuss and promote diplomacy and peace. Because our area was so densely populated with members of the little nations who, like Tammany, aided colonists in surviving in their early decades, the parish was named to honor them. So, what was it about this area that attracted the Acolapissa and their predecessors? And the one word, really, geology. The presence of aquifers and fresh running bayous carved into a higher ground made the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain an ideal place to live. And as long as a village was built about a half mile or so away from potential storm surge, the communities were well positioned. The bayous and rivers made transportation and commerce easy. Lastly, the tall woodlands, plentiful game and fish, and outstanding clay deposits, perfect for making pottery, truly made this an ideal area. So now that we've looked at the region that the Acolapissa lived, let's take a look at what was going on in the wider world. Thousands of years before outsiders set foot in North America, the land that would be called Louisiana was home to many nations. We know about them because of archaeological excavations, radiocarbon dating, and geological information. Their towns held elaborate plazas and tiered mounds, ancient cemeteries, pottery, spear points and tools, trash heaps, trade routes, and even the burial spots of domesticated dogs tell their stories from their uncovering. The ceremonial burial spots for horses entombed with bowls for grain and water also convey details about old cultures, although, as we know, horses are from post-contact as opposed to pre-contact. You've likely heard of the Clovis and Pottery Point cultures. In Mandeville, the most common older culture we hear about is the Chifuncta, but younger cultures lived here too. Within St. Tammany Parish, there are hundreds of official archaeological sites, and at least 3 dozen in Mandeville, and a brand new one whose pottery sherds you'll see tonight. These ancestral lands were where the Acolapissa lived. Now, when we look at archaeological time periods or cultures, there is an overlap between the Mississippian time period and recorded history. It is very tempting to try tying various tribes to archaeological cultures, but you can't exactly do that. Say, for example, one finds ceramics with a distinctive sun pattern, for instance, carved into them. You might say this must be evidence of the Natchez tribe. They are famous for their sun totem, and these ancient pottery pieces, therefore, have to be from their ancestors. But native people, going back millennia, who were active trade partners, either copied one another or exchanged goods. Caribbean seashells made their way to Canada. Traders who admired the imported sun pattern from the Natchez might themselves duplicate it in their home territory. All this is to say it's fun to ponder who lived where and when, but sometimes it's complete conjecture. But yet, sometimes it's not. We will do some fun pondering at the end of our chat tonight. Let's move forward in time to the start of the contact period. This is when the little nations of Louisiana and bigger confederations of indigenous peoples began meeting Spanish explorers. While their priests were attempting to spread Christianity, what the Spaniards most spread was new diseases like smallpox, diphtheria, and cholera. Never before exposed to even the mildest of European illnesses, native populations became sick and perished at terrible rates. Estimates by historians like Thornton are that in the lower 48 states, indigenous numbers dropped from 5 million to only 890,000. Millions of people perished. The fallout from these novel viruses was catastrophic. As in many cultures, the drastic changes in population led to fighting between tribal groups, competition for resources, but also in others banding together to ward off invaders. For Louisiana's many little nations, this was particularly true. Before we leave this map, notice how inaccurately the Mississippi River is drawn. Spain was successful in exploration, but they could not find the precise entrance to the Mississippi from the Gulf. Until they or another country could set up an outpost there, that land could not be claimed for their crown. And knowing that Spain had yet to claim the Mississippi corridor, France sent its explorers down from New France to do so. La Salle and his lieutenant Tonti made it down to the marshy delta in 1682, basically to where the town of Venice is today. They were badly low on supplies and gave up on building an outpost as they'd been instructed. Nevertheless, La Salle planted the French flag and the cross and claimed the river and all of its tributaries for King Louis XIV, as we all know the story. And then he left. His journals tell us that the marshes were utterly impassable. It was too swampy for deer or buffalo. No edible roots or berries. They found no fruit or nut-bearing trees, let alone any wood for firewood. During the cold, damp nights of early spring, they had to use native bamboo, or reeds, for their fires. Unfortunately, bamboo sections will occasionally explode when heated by fire, sounding just like gunshots. And the French, with us, surprised, jolt out of their sleep terrified, thinking perhaps either it was an accidental discharge or maybe an attack by the Spanish. In his final notes, La Salle bemoaned having to live off old moldy potatoes and nothing but quote unquote crocodiles. We know the French love good food, right? But it appears the gators and taters diet was not up to La Salle's standards. We know that a few years later, that after sailing across the Gulf of Mexico, La Salle tried to enter the river from the Gulf and set up an outpost. Instead, he accidentally ended up landing in Texas, where that previous river line illustration was. I wanted to show you all this particular chart to illustrate how crucial it was to have accurate maps on hand. And you can obviously see where the Mississippi is drawn, and thus wildly dangerous. The Spanish at least knew where the delta was, but even after almost a century exploring the New World, they had never made it up the river from the Gulf either. And although their nickname for the delta is fairly compelling, they called it the Scorpions for how convoluted and aggravating the little channels were. Success for the Europeans finally came 17 years later from a couple of Canadians. The Lemoyne brothers from Montreal were from a large and very affluent fur trading family. The most well-known of the 14 siblings were Pierre, called Iberville, and his brother Jean-Baptiste, called Bienville. I always remember them as Iberville the elder and Bienville the baby brother. I'm not sure he'd like that, or either one of them would, but it helps me keep them straight Anyway, when they set out to find a spot for an outpost on the Mississippi, Iberville was only 38. He would make not one but three journeys from France to La Louisiane. Iberville was an accomplished naval officer who had brought his little brother, Bienville, into the military as a cabin boy. Bienville was only 19 when they arrived in Louisiana, but he'd already been wounded in battle. He was a very capable teenager. Now, because of their upbringing in the Canadian fur trade, both brothers were good at developing relationships with native groups, living off the land and moving around in canoes. The two were essentially a perfect fit for the job. But we'll turn now to another industrious teenager along that first expedition, someone who would remain in the Louisiana Territory for 22 years. Let me introduce you to Andre Pennecup. Note the blue dot by his name and the following slides. Andre Pennecup was 18 when they departed his home country of France. He signed on with Iberville in 1698 as an indentured carpenter. Because ships, longboats, and canoes were all wooden, a carpenter was vital for repairs on even the shortest excursions. Pennicup's primary role was to guide the building of houses, defensive palisades, and forts. And he even set up support beams in a copper mine in Minnesota. Beyond carpentry, however, Andre had an excellent knack for picking up new languages. He became fluent in multiple native tongues and especially became adept at the trade language called Mobilian. It was how different nations communicated with each other, and Andre was very good at it. Andre, who lived with the Natchez and later the Acolapissa, taught them to speak French. And for historians, Pennicup's contribution came from the diaries he kept of his expeditions. For 22 years, as I've said, he chronicled what he saw. Although it wasn't until 1953 that his memoir was finally translated into English, it is known the world over for his firsthand accounts. Much of what I'll share today comes from his journal entries. Now, in full disclosure, occasionally Pennecup would be months off of recording various events or in understanding distances. Sometimes his words sounded like he was present at key events, but they were only told to him by a person who had been an eyewitness. But the 8 months that he lived with the Acolapissa are distinct in detail, but we should still take everything with a grain of salt. Now, speaking of translations, take a look at this linguistics map. Iberville, as you know, was from Montreal. When he chose men for his first expedition, most were Canadians like him, with experience in the fur trade. Many were fluent in the Iroquois and Algonquin languages, but these were not what the Biloxi and other tribes spoke along the Gulf Coast. Despite spending their months at sea teaching the French to speak Iroquois and Algonquin, nobody spoke Sioux or Muskogean. The Natchez, the Tansaw, Tunica, and Chitimaca spoke different languages as well. So did the Caddo or Natchitoches. Iberville's men used drawings and body language to communicate, and until the locals were able to teach them to speak Mobilian, that trade language was known to all. So let's talk about their arrival. In January 1699, Iberville's men anchored off the coast of Mississippi near what they called Ile aux Chats, or Cat Island. The French found strange cat-like creatures living there. These animals were described as having striped tails, funny little black masks over their faces, and incredibly, they used their front paws like hands. And of course, the French had never seen raccoons, so they only described with what they could. Wanting to set up a regular source for fresh meat and maybe having read about LaSalle's crocodile diet, they released several pigs on the island. Unfortunately, the pigs reproduced quickly and ate everything, including the poor raccoons or cats. Thanks to the French pigs, it took a century for raccoons to repopulate an island named after them. What also surprised the Canadians was how the native peoples celebrated them. After receiving gifts of farming tools, fabric, signal mirrors, and metal pots, the Biloxi wanted to honor the great chief Iberville, if you will. They grabbed him, much to the alarm of his men, but then hoisted him up onto their shoulders like a soccer champion. They proceeded to parade him around the village while everyone followed after. And in a way, it sounds like a New Orleans second line. The Pascagoula and the Bayagoula people were friendly too, and these three nations would soon introduce the French to others. What cannot be shown on this very busy map is the effort taken by at least half a dozen native groups in showing friendship and kindness to the French. The dotted green line shows the clockwise route that the Pascagoula used to introduce them to the Mississippi River. Remember, finding a good spot on the Mississippi was Iberville's main objective. The Pascagoula showed the French how to use a short overland hike, a portage, from Lake Pontchartrain to get to the river. Remember this yellow marked spot for later. They also took them on a shortcut through Lake Maurepas and connecting the river further north. That was 2 ways in. Remember, neither the Spanish nor La Salle were able to find their way from the Gulf and into the river, but the Biloxi knew it very well. They led Iberville's men from Biloxi south and around the Delta and then into the Mississippi. They instructed them, if they got confused, to repeatedly taste the water. The sweeter the water, the closer they were to the Mississippi. And it worked. Coming upriver, the Biloxi delivered them to the Bayagula. The Bayagula, whose totem was the alligator, took them past their famous Red Stick, or Baton Rouge, to the Houma. When Iberville returned in March 1700, this same territorial diplomacy was used as indicators delineating the boundaries. And when the Houma, with their red crawfish totem, handed Iberville off to the Natchez, the Sun Totem people, they then escorted them to the Tainsaw. Each new contact was made this way, having introductions made by a neighboring nation kept the French safe and respected territorial boundaries. Before we talk about meeting the Acolapissa, we need to also mention the English. Now, all of us who grew up in Louisiana are familiar with what's called Bienville's Bluff. It is known as the biggest con job in Louisiana's history. On September 15th of that busy year, Bienville and 4 others were out paddling a couple of canoes just downriver of where New Orleans would eventually be founded. To their utter shock, not a Spanish vessel, but a massive English 10-gun frigate and a follow ship sat motionless at a sharp bend in the river. They were waiting for favorable winds. And after almost 100 years of trying, neither Spain nor France had sent a warship up the Mississippi from the Gulf, but England managed to. The English were there trying to find the Mississippi River and claim all its lands to the Carolinas for England. France had yet to set up an outpost there, so they saw it as fair game. Bienville, 19 at the time, hailed the captain from his canoe, and he kindly told them that they were way off course. The river they thought was much farther west. Remember the famous map of La Salle. There was a huge French garrison just ahead, and they'd probably sink both English ships if they continued. A total and complete lie, but the English famously turned around. What is extra crazy about this story is that the English captain, Louis Bond, had 2 years earlier been captured in a naval battle in Hudson Bay. He was held aboard a French ship helmed by none other than Iberville, the 17-year-old cabin boy who waited on him, Bienville. As much fun as this story is to tell, it held a major impact for the region. Suddenly, the French needed help watching out for the Spanish and the English. Now, let's finally meet the Acolapissa. The Bayagula people, by now, were very comfortable with the French, and they'd taken Bienville and 11 others to meet the Acolapissa in one of their villages on the Pearl River. The Bayagula told Bienville that they spoke a very similar language to themselves in the Houma. Bienville and Pennaco would be able to communicate with them, having learned not just the trade language of Mobilian, but some basic Muskogean dialect too. The 19-year-olds, Pennaco and Bienville, were excited about the impending meeting. They wondered what the Acolapissa might think about meeting their first set of Europeans, and those that could speak their language. But much to their shock, 300 to 400 warriors took up weapons and stood ready for battle against the small party. Confused, the Bayagula chief told the 12 Frenchmen to stay back, and he went to speak with the Acolapissa. It turns out that they had already met their first Europeans not even 48 hours earlier. English slave raiders had turned up with 200 Chickasaw warriors, all armed with long guns. They attacked and killed Acolapissa men and captured 70 others, mostly women. The English were taking them to their slave docks in Charleston. There, they would be sold and placed on slave ships headed to the Caribbean. The Bayagula chief then explained that the French were a different tribe of Europeans. They were enemies of the English and would defend the Acolapissa from them. They could also help them arm themselves with guns. Reassured, a cautious meeting then went forward. There were about 1,600 or so people living across 7 Acolapissa hamlets near the Pearl River. Although the French Canadians were used to seeing the tattoos on native men in their homeland near Montreal, the Acolapissa were different. All of the adults, women too, were tattooed, not just on their arms and legs either. Their torsos and faces were elaborately decorated with a distinctive black ink. Pennico, when he later lived with them, learned that this black ink was made from the ashes of willow bark. Willow, as you might know, is the source of aspirin. To immediately ease pain and likely prevent inflammation more than pain, this ink was ingenious. Bienville, as we know, would show up to battles years later with his torso and arms covered in black ink. Whether it was the Acolapissa who tattooed him, I don't know. But the so-called painless or anti-inflammatory method may have appealed to him. We don't know the precise location of the 7 Acolapissa villages on the Pearl, but in 1700, Saval was the man in charge of nearby Fort Biloxi. While Iberville returned to France for men, he sent Saval to meet the Acolapissa just as Bienville had, and retain them as allies. With a name that translated as those who listen and see, perhaps they might be willing scouts to help keep watch. Saval and the priest father Paul de Roux set out to meet them in 1700 with Bayagula guides. Upon entering the primary village, however, the priest made a grievous error. He spied a tall fertility totem that he deemed as phallic and offensive to God. De Roux knocked it over and reportedly destroyed it. And while the Acolapissa reaction could have been understandably severe, their people were wrestling with illness at the time and also concerned about slave raids to the east. Knowing that they could use French allies, presumably they let this transgression go. It was around this time that the idea was floated to move the Acolapissa out of the tangles of the Pearl River inlets because of that incident at English Turn. Having capable allies because of English Turn on Lake Pontchartrain would be of great help to the French. A site on the high grounds of Castine Bayou, in today's Mandeville, were known as ancestral lands. Artifacts do confirm this. Would the Acolapissa move, though? In 1702, the Acolapissa agreed. They were just getting over a terrible bout of illness, as I had indicated earlier. About 300 of their people had perished, including warriors who were their defenders. The French made them an offer. They would offer the Acolapissa protection from slave raiders in exchange for moving towards Lake Pontchartrain, and they accepted. The site on Bayou Castine had indeed been occupied for millennia, possibly by Acolapissan ancestors. It was an excellent location. The image you see here is of the Acolapissa Great Chief's cabin. The drawing was made roughly 30 years later. Once they cleared undergrowth, rebuilt their temple, set up walking paths, new homes, gardens, and landing spots for their boats, the people were pleased. Now numbered just under 1,300, they were ready for a fresh start. The illnesses which were impacting Native Americans took some toll on the French too. Saval, who brought Father de Roux to the Acolapissa village in 1700, ended up dying of yellow fever shortly thereafter. And Iberville, who was soon heading out to the Caribbean, installed his wife's younger cousin to temporarily replace Saval at the Biloxi fort. The 27-year-old cousin-in-law, if you will, Louis Jochot Saint-Denis, was 5 years older than Bienville, and likely eager to make an impression. Now, if you'll notice the tribal names highlighted on the map here, take a look at the Nassitish. I've spelled and pronounced their name just as Pennicote did. If you talk with the Caddo people today, they'll tell you that Nassitish is the word for the fruit called the pawpaw, one of North America's largest indigenous fruits. The tribe was famous for cultivating and trading or selling them to others. And if you'll remember, the Tangipahoa, a subtribe of the Acolapissa, had their name from the white corn which they grew and sold. You might better recognize the name as Natchitoches today, but let's talk about them for a bit. The Nassitish were a very successful nation who farmed, hunted, and traded on the Red River, a tributary of the Mississippi. They held 6 fairly large-sized villages and were especially well regarded for their trading post. The flooding of their lands in 1705 precipitated a chain of events that would drastically impact the Acolapissa and the Nassitish themselves. Saint Denis, now in charge of the region at large, decided that instead of helping them rebuild after the flood, that he would move all of them, more than 1,000 souls, by boats to the Acolapissa community on Bayou Castine. Beyond the nearly 250-mile distance between the two nations, they spoke entirely different dialects. The Acolapissa, Bayagula, and Homa all spoke Muskogean-based languages. The Nasatish were a cattle linguistic group. Fortunately, they could both speak the trade language Mobilian, and as you'll recall, that's what various nations spoke during commerce and in diplomacy. The Nasatish and Acolapissa could communicate, but it was likely awkward at first. Saint Denis sent Penteco, a favorite of the Acolapissa people, to accompany the Nasatish as they moved in. Having been given no advanced warning, the Acolapissa were not exactly thrilled, but eager to maintain their alliance with the French, they likely reluctantly acquiesced. Here's that linguistic map again, showing not just the languages, but the 250-mile separation of the two nations. Let me also draw your attention to the far south of Louisiana. These were the vast lands where Chittamauga was a language. We'll talk about them and their people for a bit. A few years ago, I read an article in the Times-Picayune by Mr. Mike Scott talking about the Casket Girls. It mentioned how they and earlier arrivals of young ladies from Europe were meant to make them the first wives and mothers of Louisiana. But let's talk about the Chittamauga girls instead. After a few years in the Louisiana colony, Saint Denis and his men missed female companionship. In 1705, Saint Denis sent 15 of his soldiers to Bayou Castine, and he had them select and arm 80 Acolapissa and Nasatish warriors. The mission for these 95 armed men to attack the Chittamauga and bring back as many young women and girls as possible. They traveled up Bayou Lafourche, then known as the Chittamauga River. Before they even reached the Chittamauga village, they ran into a smaller group on a fishing expedition. They kidnapped 20 terrified girls before the badly outnumbered warriors could stop them. The girls were then taken to Biloxi and distributed to Saint Denis men. It wasn't until August 10th that Bienville, who was hundreds of miles away, learned what happened. Outraged, he demanded that the girls be returned home, but the damage was done. Baptismal records later confirmed the purpose of the girls. Bienville ordered Saint Denis out of Biloxi and down to the swampy river fort called Boulet. Unfortunately, the so-called love raids on the Chittamauga continued. Let's move our attention now back to the village on Castine Bayou, where the Acolapissa and the Nasatish were now living side by side. In May 1706, Penteco and 11 others were sent out to live on Castine Bayou when French supplies ran low. One of the young men was a fiddler by the name of Picard, and in Penteco's memoir, he talks about the great fun they all had nearly every night for the 8 months that they all lived together. The Acolapissa and Nasatish played their drums while Picard tried, mostly unsuccessfully, to match their cadence. With his violin spilling out classic European melodies and reels, the Frenchmen also taught their hosts to dance la bourrée and the minuet. Now, if you'll remember, this village on Castine Bayou is an official state archaeological site. Before the Acolapissa and Nasatish had their homes and temples here, in the early 1700s, 3 more ancient cultures had lived on site. Whether the earlier inhabitants were their ancestors, no one can fully accurately say. But the site, 16 ST 68, was immediately known as the place to go when the Acolapissa moved off the Pearl River. Here's an excerpt from Penteco's translated journal, and I'll let you go back and read this at your own leisure. Penteco presented 2 bundles of beautiful snow-white linen to the daughters of the Nasatish chief. Embroidered with little pink and green flowers, he thought they might use the brocade to each make a skirt. According to Penteco's memoir, the girls had never seen such a beautiful thing, and they squealed with delight and embraced him. But also, according to the memoir, their father, the chief, was horrified, and he insisted that Andre take the linen back at once. The Acolapissa chief, the true head of that joined community, also had a daughter, and it would not have been acceptable that the Nasatish girls would have something so fine, and his daughter nothing else. Penteco assured him that he had more linen for the Acolapissa daughter, but he learned something about their hierarchy, and they might live side by side, but this was absolutely Acolapissa land. Here again is another excerpt from Pentecost's memoir, and I'll let you refer back to it at your leisure. Living at the Acolapissa village for 8 months was a real education for Pentecost. He was particularly impressed by how easily they made cypress canoes. While it wasn't as simple as, say, popping a roast into the oven, he learned that using controlled fire to create these waterproof boats was very efficient. The French Canadians who Pentecost had traveled with had hauled birch bark canoes with them on their ships, and those canoes took great effort and time to create. And as a carpenter, he appreciated the native technique. Now, not all of us are great artists, myself included, but these later sketches by Dumont put into pictures some of the things that Andre Pentecost had recorded. You'll see men and women tattooed, and notice that other than a top knot, the men were shaven clean. Cloaks covered in turkey feathers and tree bark kept them warm in the fall. Buffalo robes were worn in the winter. And speaking of buffalo, one historian reported that the French first considered them like fluffy cattle, if you will. And after asking the natives whether they could go and shear them for their wool, they were advised that absolutely not, they would die. Um, they all had a great laugh over this. The Frenchmen were also impressed by trotline fishing, which made it easy to catch a great abundance of fish. A hunting technique that impressed Pentecost particularly involved using preserved deer skins and heads. He wrote that it made stalking deer very easily, but after seeing this painting from Dumont up on the right, I was doubtful. See the man with a deer head on a stick? Now, my Uncle Paul has 3 taxidermy deer heads hanging in his den, and I don't think I could imagine myself hauling them out into the forest to reliably secure my dinner. But that's just me. Well, either I needed a better imagination or more likely a better artist. I'm so sorry to Demont. Take a look at these 3 deer on the left. You can clearly see the hunters underneath the skins. So Pentecost was right, and the technique was also used by the Timucua people from Florida, and likely others as well. And while we're talking about fresh venison, I have to tell you that Pentecost could not stop writing about the food. Before they arrived in May 1606, the French had been subsisting mostly on dried meats and whatever intermittent game they could acquire. They were thrilled with their meals. Fish fries, extra sweet berries, crisp salad, juicy plums, roasted pumpkin, on and on he went. He and other Frenchmen learned planting techniques in addition to fishing, and in making clothing from the strands of beaten bark and nettles, feathers, and more. These skills they would later pass along and help the 200 colonists survive. The Acolapissa took their spiritual life very seriously. They prayed for 15 minutes every morning and every evening. Their temple was elaborate and massive, with religious effigies kept in 3 sacred trunks. Outside, 3 large carved birds marked the temple. The sketch we see here was made in 1732, after the Acolapissa had moved their villages down to the Mississippi. The way Pentecost described the 3 sacred birds matches the way de Botts drew in his documents. The birds were thick as turkeys, but with the heads of eagles. Other writers of the time recorded that the Bayagula and Mugalasha had nearly identical temples, built side by side. Notice, too, in the drawing, the Acolapissa man on the right. He has a leashed pet animal at his side, and if you can read French, you'll know that ourson means bear cub. One thing I found interesting was Pentecost's description of the 3 locked chests kept inside the temple. One held some stone and wooden carvings of frogs, another of snakes, and for me, the most surprising was the word that Pentecost used, dragons. Initially, I thought the 1953 translation must have been off, but I was incorrect. What Pentecost might have seen, and had no other words to describe, were carvings of winged and horned snakes. If you look at the pottery piece from Mandeville on the right, can you see the wing? There was a spiritual belief held by many nations along the Gulf Coast that archaeologists call the Southeastern ceremonial complex cult. The Natchez and the Tainsaw also kept figures of snakes in their temples. Snakes, because they shed their skins and live on, represented long life and tenacity. Frogs, who transform from eggs into polywogs and then into their adult bodies, might be seen to represent changes in life. But the so-called dragon, its wings tied to heaven and to God, while its serpentine body relates to the earth. in the afterlife that ascendance is meaningful. Speaking of the afterlife, we know from Penteco how the Acolapissa mourn their deceased loved ones for 6 moons, and their veneration of those who passed on was strong. While living with the Acolapissa, Penteco never witnessed their mourning rituals for great chiefs, but we know that the Homa, one of the Muskogean nations with whom the Acolapissa eventually merged, had very elaborate ceremonies for their beloved chiefs.
Did it pause?
Yeah, put your current video
weird.
in the circle.
Yeah, I'm like looking at myself right now. That's kind of strange. Okay.
The Mandeville Massacre of 1714 was an event that started with saying goodbye. As the year 1714 came towards its close, the Acolapissa and Natchitoches had been living relatively peaceably together for just shy of a decade. We do not have records of it, but with a joint population of roughly 3,000 people, presumably teenagers of both nations may have intermarried and started their own families. Both chiefs become grandfathers. All three of the girls were now around 30, so it's more likely than not. Unfortunately, the peaceful coexistence of the two tribes was about to end. Because Saint Denis, now stationed on the Red River, learned that Spain had become active just 15 miles to the west, he wanted a fort built and quickly. But he needed a workforce to build it and warriors to defend it. So his solution was to move the Natchitoches back to their ancestral lands, even after 10 years of separation. With no forewarning, he sent Penteco to Castine Bayou to collect and move the Natchitoches the 250 miles back northwest. Saint Denis was waiting in Biloxi with ships he would provide to assist in the move, but they were to leave the following morning. Both chiefs, of course, were understandably stunned, but the Natchitoches elders may have pined for a return home. Initially, both chiefs acquiesced to the French request, but overnight, it's likely that Acolapissa elders voiced their reservations. For the intermarried couples, would Acolapissa daughters leave with their Natchitoches husbands? Would the opposite be expected? What about the grandchildren? In the morning, as the debate came out into the open, a skirmish erupted. Then a battle ensued. Penteco tried to reason with the warriors of both nations, but they were not to be stopped. Andre jumped in front of the Natchitoches chief, yanking him out of harm's way. And Penteco counted 17 dead Natchitoches warriors before he ran into the woods, pulling the chief with him. He was not able to get a final count on how many lives were lost. If you would like to read Penteco's account in more detail, you can come back to this slide later. As the massacre turned to a lull, the surviving Natchitoches had then crossed through the woods after sunset and made it to Lake Pontchartrain. But not everyone was accounted for. More than 50 young moms and girls were left behind. Were the Natchitoches girls captured, so to speak, by Acolapissa husbands or grandparents? Were they actually Acolapissa girls married to Natchitoches husbands? Did they stay willingly? We don't know and really can't. But, as you can imagine, Saint Denis was livid. Yes, enough Natchitoches men had survived to complete the move and build his fort, but the loss of the 50 native women, regardless of their nation, greatly bothered him. We know how he viewed native women. He threatened dire consequences unless they were returned. I can't find anything in the historical records that tells us whether the women and girls were returned. But what we do know is that this was the breaking point for tolerance from the Acolapissa. After 14 years, the price for protection from slave raiders to the east had become far too much to bear. Just as they had in 1702, the Acolapissa packed up and left. As we close out our talk tonight, we know where the Acolapissa finally ended up, but I hope you'll enjoy pondering with me about a bit of a mystery and how they got there. So what happened next is what's called a gap in the historical record. 1714, the Acolapissa were on Bayou Castine, where the massacre occurred. You'll remember the gold star from Mandeville on our maps. The next we hear of them in 1717 and 18, they showed up at a village of another tribe to smoke the Calumet peace pipe. New batches of French officials kept arriving, and every tribal group was expected to travel over and greet them. Despite terrible threats from Saint Denis, Penaco assumed that they had stayed put for a few years after the massacre, then moved down the Mississippi to be with the Bayagula in 1718. But that was impossible. The new incursions of French officials were being toured up the river and introduced to every single native village along the way. In 1718 and 1720, the Acolapissa were simply not there. It wasn't until 1722 that we know they were living next to the Bayagula and the Homa, actively trading deerskins and meat with priests from the brand new town called New Orleans. This spot, marked in yellow, is the same place that La Salle and Tonty noted in 1682, and it's where the French were taken from Lake Pontchartrain in 1699 to get their first view of the Mississippi. In 1732, this is also where the artist de Botts stayed with them and drew the sketches we looked at earlier. Remember the bear cub? So the question is, between 1714 and 1721, where did they go? In this way, we could say the Acolapissa might have gone AWOL between that time period. And because of the threats made by Saint Denis, it seems reasonable that they may have wanted to keep a low profile. I would do the same. I never gave it another thought until 2023. But that year, a brand new and huge archaeological site was discovered that got me thinking. What was exciting was that this new discovery, not even a mile from my house, had unusual similarity to the site on Bayou Castine. Now, as I mentioned at the start of our chat, it is not possible to officially tie archaeological findings to individual tribal groups, but I do confess that it is fun to ponder. So will you indulge me for a moment? Here's the deal. The artifacts that were discovered and examined 40 years ago on Bayou Castine were very odd in comparison with other local Louisiana pottery, or ceramics as they're called. That site, which I mentioned earlier, 16ST68, or better known as Picard's Fiddle, was discovered by Johnson. Well, lo and behold, these new on pieces near my house are very similar to the same ones from Bayou Castine. Does this mean that the same or similar ancient people lived at both places? If in fact Bayou Castine was an ancestral home to the Acolapissa, do these newly discovered pieces mean that it too was occupied by their forebears? This is an entirely speculative bit of conjecture, but there are little tidbits of history that support the idea that the Acolapissa may have hidden out on Bayou Chinchuba. Here's what we do know. Around 1710, illness and attacks from the Tansaw and the Tunica reduced the Bayagula and the Homa populations by more than half. They were struggling. By 1722, despite both tribes having once been enemies with the Acolapissa, the three became very tight and loyal allies. They built up their villages next to one another in 1722, as you saw on the map. And before that, we don't know exactly where they were. The totem for the Bayagula was the alligator, for which the Muskogean word is Chinchuba. Remember that the Tangipahoa River was named for the people. Chittamacca River was also named for the people. Lake Washaw was named for the people. Was Bayou Chinchuba named for the people or for its alligators? The totem for the Homa was and still is the red crawfish. We know from oral histories shared by Choctaw elders that the people who lived on Bayou Chinchuba were known as the crawfish people. But should we trust oral histories from 1902? Perhaps or perhaps not. Did all three nations live on the ancestral grounds on Bayou Chinchuba? I don't think we'll ever fully rightly know, but look for an upcoming publication about this wildly unusual archaeological find. A big shout out to Dr. Chip McGimsey, and he will have some fascinating and groundbreaking news soon. While I appreciate your patience with this little mystery, I suppose, I find it important that before we close out, we mention other little nations who joined the Acolapissa, the Bayagula and the Homa. They maintained separate dances and celebrations, essentially their own identities, for as long as humanly possible. But as the people further died from European diseases and encroachment from colonists, they would eventually move farther south and merge. The town where they finally settled today bears the name of the Homa, though it is not my place to consider. I think of it as a home to many nations, and I'm sure the Homa would agree. By 1776, the Acolapissa and other little nations had merged with the Homa, and the tribal names were considered, on the record, extinct. Regardless, they were treated as important allies to the French. The remaining Acolapissa traded with them out of necessity. But that's not to say all was forgiven. A couple families even returned to St. Tammany Parish to live on Bayou Liberty in 1724. And when the French Chickasaw Wars erupted in 1736, there were certain Acolapissa warriors who chose to ally with their longtime enemies, the Chickasaw. They were actually battling against the French. Blazing their fierce black ink, it is unknown whether the Bienville, wearing his black snake tattoos, spied the Acolapissa wearing theirs, but I rather hope he did. In closing, although the official name of the Acolapissa has been considered extinct since 1776, we know this to not be true. Their proud descendants walk among us today and will continue to do so. We may not know them all by name, but for all time we honor the Acolapissa. And thank you. Thank you for helping me do so this evening, because we're not here to tell stories. Stories belong to people and to cultures. We're here to amplify voices and to lend credence to those stories, but not tell them in anyone's stead. Thank you.
Really fascinating work you've done, Jackson. Really impressive. If anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat. I'm going to kick it off with a couple questions that I had, what I picked up as we went along. You mentioned 5 million natives that ended up with, was the correct number was 8,500, you said?
Around 860,000.
860,000, 5,860,000.
Correct.
Okay. So thank you. So that's a little better than, but
Certainly.
yeah, yeah. Why did some survive? Were there some that survived at a higher rate than others did? And was there any reason why one tribe might have been more likely to survive compared to others that were decimated completely?
Well, it was more so on an individual basis. Not one specific indigenous group was more likely to survive than anybody else. It's really just about immunity. So somebody who had gotten a milder case of, say, smallpox or something like that, and who ended up carrying that and spreading it to other people in that same minor form, wouldn't have been as likely to then, create a larger scale epidemic. So certain, especially familial units, groups that were close knit, if someone was able to have that extra immunity or inoculation, if you will, they were able to more likely survive. But because the vast majority of indigenous peoples at the time of the contact period didn't have any immunity to these diseases, they were wiped out en masse because of that lack of antibody.
Yeah, really, really fascinating. And a really a horrible number to get down to. Um, um, Andre, how do you say his last name again? Piccolo?
Penico.
Pinnacle. Very fascinating character. First, did he also speak Spanish and English or anything like that? Or, what's the theory behind why he was able to speak native languages so well? I mean, that's an unbelievable skill that he was, and obviously was very much in demand.
Certainly. I'm unaware if he spoke English or Spanish. I presume that if he was, acting as a diplomat or something of that sort, he might have known a bit of phrases, maybe Latin and Greek, the type of stuff that educated people back in the day really kind of not obsessed over, but kind of fortified their linguistic skills. And some people just are natural polyglots. Other times it's simply because of immersion. I have studied a few languages in my time, Spanish, Italian, even ancient Egyptian. I took 4 semesters of that. And when you're closer to a culture and when you're embedded within it, you're far more able to just, act as a linguistic sponge, if you will. It's so much easier to do that. So maybe there was some innate ability that Pennico had, or maybe it was because he was so consistently documenting and immersing himself in those cultures that he just absorbed it a bit better.
And do you take his writings as good as you're going to get to describe because of his the way he was, you know, uh, immersed us in a culture?
Um, I would say that he tends to be a bit more accurate than some other European outside observers, if you will, because he was so enmeshed with the culture. But of course, you can only go so far as a fully, outside observer of a culture that, if you read the writings, he didn't necessarily think of them as equals. He appreciated these cultures, but one of the legacies of settler colonialism is supremacy and those sort of ideals. Um, so he had some biased perceptions of the Acolapissa. In fact, you can read other writings from his description and everything else that is somewhat disparaging of Native groups. But because he was more willing to learn and understand, and even though you do have to take everything with a grain of salt, as I mentioned in the video, he is far more accurate than some other European primary sources.
Someone asked, as I mentioned that the Acolapissa went to Lafourche Interior and Barataria. Is that sound right?
Yes, so they kind of went around the lake through Maurepas and then down river towards present day Homa. Mhm.
And then we have one more question. Were there Native American illnesses that impacted Europeans?
There were a few. One specifically is the most infamous syphilis. As we know from the what you call it, the so-called love raids on the indigenous groups of the Chitimaca, Chickasaw, so on and so forth. A lot of European men and women, after they returned to Europe, came down with syphilis. And without the introduction of antibiotics much, much later, syphilis was a significantly destructive and debilitating disease.
And when it came to yellow fever, were the natives very much more acclimated to that than were the? I mean, obviously the Europeans struggled
Mhm.
for a long period of time with yellow fever, but were they affected by that as well?
Well, they concentrated around much higher terrain, which, if you know anything about mosquitoes, they love low-lying terrain. Dark areas, swampy areas, you get the gist. We've all had our fair share of mosquito bites here. Um, but because of that higher ground, and yes, closeness to water, but distanced from stagnant water, they were less likely to come into contact with large swarms of festering pools of mosquitoes. That plus the immunity that I mentioned previously, because they had consistently gotten yellow fever in large doses or small doses throughout their history of being in the region. Yes, they definitely did have a bit more immunity than other groups. Um, so yellow fever itself, I'm not the expert when it comes to virology or anything like that, but there's a number of different books about yellow fever and other um, major diseases that impacted specifically South Louisiana. I don't remember any off the top of my head, but it's a widely researched and extensive topic.
Yeah, and Bailey says, and the praxis tests stated it came from natives. So, very interesting information there. Well, this is going to conclude tonight. I just want to mention next week we have Dr. Petra Hendry. She's going to be doing Reimagining the Educated Citizen, Creole Pedagogies in the Transatlantic World, 1685 to 1896. And that is next Tuesday at 6 p.m. If you're signed up for tonight, you'll and you have the maintained membership, you'll be automatically emailed that, so you don't have to re-sign up for that or anything like that. But really wonderful, Jackson. You've done an unbelievable job. That was an absolutely fantastic presentation, and I congratulate you on your hard work. And we look forward to hearing more from you as you keep working probably on this topic, because there's a lot more to explore here. So thank you so much. We appreciate it. It was really, really wonderful.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And the recordings, I believe, will be coming out tomorrow at some point. I can also send a link to the sort of view PowerPoint if other people would like. Jason, have people coordinate with you, and we'll see what people think.
Yeah, I'll be sending out the recording in the first thing in the morning when I get into the office. So thank you so much to everybody. And Jackson, thank you so much. We really do appreciate it. Really fantastic work.
So happy to help, and so happy to spread this little story of Louisiana and its peoples, past and present. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night. Thank you.